Hello everyone, this is Mr. Jackson, and today we're going to be finishing up our conversation of Concept 1 in Part C, where we're going to finish up with our biology review. We're going to be looking a little bit more into our macromolecules, and that's a big portion of our living tissue. We want to understand what's making that up. And then also we're going to finish with our conversation on enzymes and why those are so important to us as well. Now we left off with Part 1B talking about these living tissues and how they're composed. Okay, so remember, most of your living tissue is water, 70%, but about a quarter of your living tissues are made up of these building blocks that we call macromolecules. And so within that 26% of your macromolecules, we also can break down those four major categories or four major macromolecules to see the relative proportions of those. And if you look to the top right over here, you can see that the majority of the macromolecules that make up our tissues are structurally proteins. Okay, so we have quite a lot of these living tissues made up of these proteins because proteins, we'll find, have such a wide variety of functions in our bodies. The second most abundant are our lipids. That's another word for fats. And third place would go to our carbohydrates. We'll go into what each of these purposes actually are, how they serve us, at least primarily. And then finally, we also have within those tissues our nucleic acids, and we'll go into a breakdown of what those are, what that means. So macro, anytime you see the word macro, we're referring to something that's rather large. Okay, so macromolecules are just larger molecules. Okay, they're very complex. There's a lot to them. Okay. And so we refer to these macromolecules as polymers. Again, anytime you see the word poly, that's referring to many. And anytime you see that they're made up of smaller molecules or monomers, anytime you see mono, that's referring to a singular component or just like one of something. Okay, so mono is one, poly is many. And so these smaller molecules that we'll go into typically are going to be linked together in these covalent bonds. That just means that their outer shells, they share electrons, so this keeps them together, essentially. And basically those come together to make these really large molecules we call polymers. And each of these macromolecules plays a critical role in the organisms with regard to running our bodies. They contain the information for how to do all of the functions within our bodies, and they also provide us with energy to fuel those functions within our bodies. And so for this, in your guided notes, you're going to see that I actually have included this table. And it's important to actually spend time with each of these macromolecules to break down what they are, what the monomers, so those individual little building blocks are that make them up, some examples of what they are so that we can recognize them later, but importantly and crucially, what they actually do in the body. Okay? So the first one that we'll go over are our nucleic acids. Okay, these are made up of individual nucleotides. So these are in your DNA and your RNA, and those individual nucleotides are referring to your adenines, thymines, cytosines, guanines, uracils. And it's not all that important that we have those specifically in mind, but it is important to understand that with these nucleic acids, namely our DNA, our RNA, those genetic components, this is going to be our information molecules, right? So these contain the blueprint. These are going to store and transmit and express our genetic information. Our next macromolecule are our lipids, again, fats. We have some examples of what those are, like fats and oils. They also help make up our phospholipids, which are important for all of your cell membranes to keep certain things out and to keep certain things in. But primarily, the function here is that they're energy storage, right? They're actually the most energy dense of our macromolecules. So we really like using these lipids during low intensity activity to fuel most of our metabolic pathway. The next macromolecule are our carbohydrates. We have what our monomer is here, those monosaccharides. We have some examples of what these look like. And again, just like our lipids, this is another energy storage molecule. Only difference is that we typically will use carbohydrates for higher intensity or moderate intensity activities. So whenever we have to exert ourselves physically, that's typically where we'll start using our carbohydrate storage. And then also finally, the majority of what makes up our living tissues is the proteins. These are made up of amino acids, and we're going to talk about one of these in great detail today, which is enzymes. But the main thing is just understanding that these proteins essentially do so much that we can just refer to their job as everything that's not these energy storage. They also do provide some energy if they need to as a last resort during fasting or starvation states. But for the most part, I mean, these things are really good for structural. They serve as transport, storage, protection, a lot of different things going on with proteins. Now, we want to break down this into a couple of highlights real quick. It's important to understand that when it comes to those nucleic acids, and we use an example being our DNA, remember that your DNA is ultimately in every single cell within the nucleus. Your DNA is organized into 46 chromosomes, or 23 pairs, and each of those chromosomes could contain thousands upon thousands of different genes. And each of those genes provide an instruction for how your body can make a specific protein. And each of those proteins in mass, as those come together, again, those macromolecules, all those proteins and other macros coming together to form your organelles, which give your cells a unique identity with a unique job. All of those proteins essentially come together to run your body, right? You are a collection of your proteins. And so one gene might get transcribed, and we're going to make a copy, and it's leaving the nucleus. It goes to the site where we actually use that information, and we build a fully functional protein at the site of that ribosome. And it's a highly regulated process. We want to make sure that we read the correct information and we use it to make the correct proteins to do the correct jobs. And so this is a very, very important thing to keep in mind. And finally, we want to finish up with identifying one of these big examples of proteins, and that is our enzymes. Now, enzymes they're mostly proteins. They are referred to as biological catalysts, and catalysts are these enzymes that basically speed up the rate of reactions in our bodies so we can have really quick turnover whenever we need certain processes to go rather quickly. And it actually acts as a catalyst. It speeds up these reactions because it basically lowers the amount of energy necessary in order for something to begin. Okay, so we call that its activation. In order to become active, normally it would take a whole lot of energy. Enzymes help that process go faster by lowering what's required. They're highly specific, only binding to certain substrates at their active sites. And so you can see right here, this enzyme will have essentially a very specific lock, right? A very specific shape that it can bond to. And only a substrate, like a key, that fits that enzyme lock, only that could possibly interact with this enzyme. And that's really important because if we want enzymes to do specific jobs, we don't want them to get overly crowded with the wrong things. We don't want a bunch of keys blocking our locks. We want them to be ready to do the jobs they're there to do. And luckily, enzymes are extremely good at just that, right? They only bind to specific substrates, like locks only allow for specific keys. And the cool thing is, after that lock allows a certain key in and it does its work, and it creates those products that it ultimately is responsible for, it remains unchanged, meaning that after that one substrate comes and goes, another substrate can come in and it can repeat its job over and over and over so that we have really high output. These are absolutely critical for that regulation process that we talked about whenever all of life basically has to work through this system of organs that make you up as an organism, as a human being. And so I think that's more than enough to go off of for our biology review. I really appreciate you staying in it and being a part of the conversation. And as always, if you have any questions about this content, please let me know. Don't keep it a secret. I'd love to help further if I can. We'll see you at the next one.